One of the other common gotchas that you have to watch out for when you're using languages like C# or Objective-C or Java or anything else that's a compiled language is the notion of variable scope. All variables have what's called a scope. This is where the variable is visible to the code and can be used. So let's take a look at an example and then I'll explain it. So suppose I had a function named myFunction, and inside that function I had a variable called x. And I've declared the variable x and I've assigned it a value of 10. And suppose I also have a for loop, and inside the for loop I've got a variable named y, which I'm declaring inside the for loop, and the value of y is being set to the value of x plus 20. That's okay because I can refer to the value of x inside the for loop. I can declare the y variable inside the for loop as well. Now I can also refer to the x variable here. If I wanted to use the increment operator on x outside the for loop, that's fine. And I can also increment x outside the for loop after the for loop. That's fine too. What I can't do, however, is refer to the y variable outside of the for loop. Why? Because it's not a variable there. I've declared it inside the for loop. And in this case, when you declare the variable inside those curly braces, that variable is only valid inside those curly braces. That's because in languages like C#, variables have what's called a block scope. Those curly braces define a block of code the same way that the curly braces near the function define a block of code. This is not the case in a language like JavaScript. And the reason is because in languages like JavaScript, variables have function level scope. When the JavaScript interpreter goes to interpret the function, it first looks through the function to find variable declarations, and then it lifts them to the top of the function. It does that internally. It doesn't modify your script code. But it gives all the variables inside the function the same function level scope. That is not true in a language like C#. In a language like C# or a language like C or Objective-C or Java, the variable is only available to you in the block where it is declared. So let's take a look at this in action and we can see how it works. Over here in the code, I've got my variable scope project open. And here in the snippets, I've scrolled down to the variable scope. And I'm going to copy these lines. I'm going to paste it in right here. So here I have my loop. And you can see inside the loop, I'm declaring a variable named int var1. So when I run this program, let's just run it really quick. You can see that what's going to happen is I'm going to right line the value of var1 at pass whatever I is whatever the value of var1 is. So I'm going to run it. And you can see that it's staying the value of 20 all the way through the loop. So now let's take a look at what happens when I try to uncomment this line of code here. I'm going to try to right line the last value of var1, but I'm going to do it outside the for loop. I'm going to save. And you can see that I'm getting a little red squiggle there, which basically says, hey, the name var1 does not exist in the current context. That's because it's declared inside this for loop. So if I wanted to do this, I would have to cut that and move it up here and save, and now everything works fine. So let's go ahead and undo that, put it back where it was. You might be wondering, hey, in other languages, I can redeclare variables in different scopes and they're just given different meanings. So for example, the C and Objective-C languages let you do something like this. And what I've done here is I've declared the variable var1 in a separate scope than the other var1 that's inside the for scope. Inside the for loop, you would think that this variable would have its own scope and this one would have a different one, but that's not the way C# works. This can be very confusing to someone who's reading the code, and it's also the source of a lot of bugs in other languages. So the designers of C# explicitly don't allow variables to be declared in separate scopes with the same name. And you can see that when I try to do this, there's a little squiggle down here that says, hey, a local variable named var1 cannot be declared in this scope because it would give a different meaning to var1, which is already used in a parent or current scope to denote something else. So these two variables conflict with each other, so I can't do this. It's important to note that this kind of scope level referencing only works from the inside out. So if I declare the variable var1 in here, I can refer to it within this scope. But if I declared it out here, then I would be able to refer to it in this current function level scope as well as all the other scopes that are contained within the function. So for example, I could do something like this. And that works just fine because the for loop scope is contained within the scope for the main function. So in fact, if I save this and I run it, you'll see that var1 is getting incremented by 10 each time. And now that last little console, that right line that I've got that says, what the last value of var1 was, is working just fine. Understanding variable scope is a pretty important part of writing good C# code. And it's something that you should pay close attention to, especially if you're coming from a language like JavaScript that does not enforce these kinds of rules. This kind of thing can bite you, so pay attention to it.